him. Today, we are going to be diving into every single one of these sick and demented crimes that John Wayne Gacy committed. If you did not watch part 1, I highly suggest going back and watching part 1 before you watch part 2. Alright, so with that being said, let's just dive right into the crimes of John Wayne Gacy. In January of 1972, a 16-year-old boy named Timothy Jack McCoy was traveling from Michigan to Omaha, Nebraska. It was on January 2nd when he arrived to the Chicago's Greyhound bus terminal, where he would be picked up by John Wayne Gacy, who took him around a sightseeing tour of the city. After this, Gacy drove with Timothy back to his house, where he would spend the night with the promise of being driven back to the bus station the next morning. According to Gacy, when he woke up that morning, he actually woke up to Timothy standing at his bedroom doorway with a kitchen knife in hand. This is when Gacy sprung from his bed and lunged at Timothy. This is when Timothy raised his hands, tilting the knife upward, accidentally cutting Gacy's forearm that left him with a permanent scar. Gacy then twisted the knife from Timothy's hand, banged his head against the bedroom wall, kicked him against the wardrobe, and then walked towards him. Timothy kicked Gacy in the stomach before Gacy grabbed him, then stabbed him repeatedly in the chest as he was straddling him. Gacy then went to the kitchen only to find an open carton of eggs and a slab of uncooked bacon on the table. Timothy had set the table for 2 and had just been walking into Gacy's room to wake him up to let him know about breakfast, without even realizing that he still had the knife in his hand. So basically, this entire murder of a 16-year-old boy was just a big misunderstanding. Maybe if Gacy wasn't going around assaulting people, his mind wouldn't just jump to someone trying to kill him automatically and listen to what he had to say before he just killed him. Either way, Gacy buried Timothy's body in his crawl space and later covered his grave with concrete. Gacy said that he felt totally drained after doing this, but he had an intense sexual arousal as he was killing Timothy. This was Gacy's first murder, and also when he realized that the death was the ultimate thrill, which almost kind of makes me believe that this entire story, that it was just an accident or a misunderstanding. I almost don't believe it because, I mean, he enjoyed it so much and he probably knew that he was going to, so I think this was just kind of a story that he made up. I don't know. It was almost 2 years later when Gacy committed his second murder on an unknown teenaged boy. So I do want to go back and refer to episode 1 where we talked about after the first murder, serial killers will have a massive cooling off period, and whether him waiting this long be because his family was living in the house or because of this very long cooling off period, it kind of does show that once they do it once, they don't need to do it right away to feel that second high. But then after they do it again, they need to do it more often, and we definitely see that with John Wayne Gacy. But either way, this unknown teenage boy was known to have medium brown hair and was between the ages of 14 and 18. Gacy killed this boy using strangulation and stowed his body in a closet initially, but fluid started leaking out of the boy's mouth and nose, which is just absolutely disturbing. After this, Gacy started stuffing rags in the mouths of his victims to prevent leakage. After stowing him in the closet, Gacy buried him in his backyard about 15 feet away from the barbecue pit in his backyard. By 1975, Gacy's business was booming and growing very quickly. He started working 12 to 16-hour days and getting more and more contracts. This was also around the time when he started increasing the amounts of times that he would go out cruising looking for sexual encounters with young boys. Now, like I said earlier, a lot of the employees of PDM contractors were young men, high school students ages 14 to 18. One of these teens was 15-year-old Anthony Antonucci, who was hired in May of 1975. In July of 1975, Gacy went over to Anthony's house while he was home alone, and he wasn't at work because he had just injured his foot the day before. Just as he did, he got Anthony drunk, but this time he wrestled Anthony to the floor and handcuffed his hands behind his back. However, the cuff on Anthony's right wrist was loose, so as soon as Gacy left the room, Anthony had freed his arm from the handcuff and pounced on Gacy when he returned to the room. Anthony was on his high school's wrestling team, so he was able to wrestle Gacy to the ground and cuffed his hands behind his back. This entire time, Gacy was screaming and threatening Anthony, but eventually calmed down and said that he would leave if he freed him from the cuffs. He was impressed with Anthony. He said to Anthony, "Not only are you the only one who got out of the cuffs, but you got them on me. On July 29th, 1975, a week after the attempted assault on Anthony, 18-year-old John Butkovich went missing. John was another one of Gacy's employees, and the day prior, John had threatened Gacy because he hadn't been paid for 2 weeks after he was supposed to. Gacy had lured John to his home while his wife and kids were in Arkansas with the muse of settling the issues with the wages. However, when John arrived, Gacy was able to convince him to cuff his wrists behind his back. Gacy then strangled him to death and buried his body under the concrete floor in his garage. After John had gone missing, they found his Dodge sedan in a parking lot with the wallet in the car and the keys still in the ignition. This is when John's father actually called Gacy, who said he'd be happy to help search for John, but that he was so sorry that he would run away like this. Of course, Gacy was questioned about John's disappearance, and he admitted that John and 2 friends had been over to discuss the late paycheck, but said that the 3 boys left after a compromise had been made. Over the next 3 years, John's parents called police over 100 times, begging them to investigate Gacy further. These killings continued, where Gacy would lure his victims over. He would get them intoxicated with drugs or alcohol after gaining their trust just enough, then would get them to let him cuff them, kind of playing it off as a joke. After he was able to cuff the teenage boys, he would sexually abuse and torture them before strangling them to death. Now, in October of 1975, Carol and Gacy had gotten into a heated argument over money issues. Before this, she had been noticing that Gacy was coming home late and saying he was working late. She had also noticed that he was bringing teenage boys into the garage and found a bunch of pornography in the house. This was the final straw for Carol, and she asked him for a divorce. She continued living in the home until February of 1976, when her and her 2 daughters left and moved out of the apartment. On March 2nd, the 2 were divorced. Throughout all this, Gacy was still the upstanding citizen that everyone knew him to be, but people around the neighborhood started becoming aware of these bizarre changes in his behavior after the divorce. These behaviors were things like them noticing his car leaving and coming in the early hours of the mornings, and his lights switching on and off at odd hours in the morning, and they noticed that he was spending a lot of time with young men. So after the divorce is when the killing sprees really began, now that he had the house completely to himself and he could do whatever he wanted. He no longer had to wait for his family to leave or be really careful of who would see what. About only a month after the divorce, on April 6, 1976, an 18-year-old teenager named Daryl Sampson went missing. 5 weeks later, on May 14th, 15-year-old Randall Raffett went missing while walking home from Senn High School. Daryl Sampson was abducted and murdered and buried under his dining room floor. Randall had been gagged with a cloth, causing him asphyxiation. Only a few hours after Randall went missing, a 14-year-old boy named Samuel Stapleton went missing as he walked home from his sister's apartment. Both Randall and Samuel had been buried under Gacy's crawl space. So this is when it really starts accelerating, and I'm going to go into every single victim that he took and murdered, and you will be shocked at how little time went between each person. It is absolutely appalling. Michael Bonin was a 17-year-old male who was traveling from Chicago to Waukegan, Illinois. On June 3rd, 1976, Gacy abducted and murdered Michael and buried him in the crawl space. Only 10 days later, he abducted and murdered 16-year-old William Carroll and buried him directly underneath his kitchen. Now, between June 13th and August 6th, 1976, Gacy killed an unidentified man with medium brown hair, estimated to be between 23 and 30 years old, between 5'1" and 5'6", and missing 2 of his upper front teeth. He also murdered 16-year-old James Hackinson from Minnesota, who was last known to have spoken with his family on August 5th. And then 17-year-old Rick Johnston from Bensonville, Illinois, who was last seen on August 6th. All 4 men, William, the identified male, James, and Rick, were all buried directly underneath Gacy's kitchen. Another unidentified male between the ages of 15 and 24 with light brown hair was thought to have been murdered between the dates of August 6th and August 20th and was buried underneath the kitchen. On July 26th, 1976, Gacy hired 18-year-old David Cram, and on August 21st, David moved into the Gacy house. On August 22nd, of course, Gacy got David drunk and convinced him into letting him handcuff him. Gacy was swinging David around, telling him what he was about to do, but since David had previously been in the Army for for a year. He kicked Gacy in the face, got himself free from the handcuffs, and left as Gacy was lying there on his stomach. Despite the attack, David continued living at the home, and about a month later, Gacy showed up at David's bedroom door and said, "Dave, you really don't know who I am. Maybe it would be a good idea if you just give me what I want." David still resisted, and Gacy eventually left. After this, David finally moved out of Gacy's house, left PDM contractors, but still stuck around to work for Gacy every so often, which I don't really understand, but I don't really know the whole story behind it, so I don't want to judge, but at the same time, he did try to assault you multiple times, so I don't understand why he would stick around like that. But either way, right after David left, 18-year-old David Rossi moved into Gacy's house. Another unidentified male between the ages of 18 and 22 years old with dark brown wavy hair was thought to have been killed sometime between August and October of 1976 and buried in the crawl space. One employee of PDM contractors recalled digging a trench around the date of October 5th in the same location that this male was found, so it's estimated that he was murdered and buried around this date. On October 24th, 1976, two teenage boys, Kenneth Parker and Michael Moreno, were seen outside of a restaurant on Clark Street before they were both abducted by Gacy. They were both strangled and buried in the crawl space at Gacy's home. 2 days later, on October 26th, 19-year-old William Bundy, another one of PDM contractors' workers, went missing after he told his parents that he was going to go to a party. He was strangled and buried in the crawl space directly underneath Gacy's bedroom. In December of 1976, another PDM employee who had only worked there for about 3 weeks, 17-year-old Gregory Godzik, disappeared. He was last seen by his girlfriend outside of her house after he had driven her home after a date. Before he went missing, he had told his family that Gacy had him dig trenches for him in his crawl space. A few days later, Gregory's car was found in Niles, Illinois. Gregory's parents and his older sister contacted Gacy about the disappearance, and Gacy had told them that Greg had actually previously hinted at wanting to run away from home. So of course, that's what he thought happened. He had also claimed to have received a voicemail from Greg basically saying the same thing, that he wanted to run away, but he said that he actually deleted it. On January 20th, 1977, 19-year-old Don Zike was lured to Gacy's house thinking that he was going to be selling his Plymouth satellite to Gacy. He was murdered and buried in the crawl space. He actually had a ring with his initials on it, and Gacy actually kept that ring in a dresser in his master bedroom. He also kept his portable Motorola TV in his room and sold his car to Michael Rossi. Between December of 1976 and March of 1977, Gacy murdered an unidentified male thought to be around 25 years old. A key fob found with his personal belongings was inscripted with the name Greg or Gregory, leading investigators to believe that this was his first name. He, too, was buried in the crawl space. On March 15th, Gacy murdered 20-year-old John Prestige, who was from Michigan and was visiting friends in Chicago. After John, Gacy is believed to have killed another unidentified male between the ages of 17 and 21 years old and was found with a fractured left collarbone. He was also buried in Gacy's crawl space. After this, Gacy took a bit of a break on his murderous rampage when he was hired as a construction supervisor for PE Systems, which was a firm that specialized in remodeling drugstores all over the country. Because of this, Gacy traveled to other states very frequently to supervise construction projects. He was doing this and still working for his own company, PDM Contractors, at the same time, so he was very busy. In April of 1977, Michael Rossi moved out of Gacy's house. That same month, Gacy became engaged to a woman that he had been dating for 3 months, and she moved into his house. However, this engagement did not last very long, and they called it off in June, and she moved out of the house. That July, Gacy went on to murder 19-year-old Matthew Bowman and buried him in the crawl space with the rope used to strangle him still around his neck. In August of 1977, Michael Rossi, who was in possession of John Sykes' car, was arrested for stealing gasoline from a service station while he was driving John's car. The attendant reported the license plate to police, and that plate was tracked back to Gacy's house. When police questioned him, Gacy actually said that John sold him the car because he needed money to leave town. Police didn't think anything of this and didn't question him any further. All they did was inform John's mother that Gacy did have John's car. In late 1977, Gacy started dating Carol Hoff again, hoping that the two could just pick up where they left off. Then in September of 1977, 1977, Gacy murdered 18-year-old Robert Gilroy, who was the son of a Chicago police sergeant. He was suffocated and buried in the crawl space. 10 days later, 19-year-old U.S. Marine John Mowry went missing after leaving his mother's house to walk back to his own apartment. He was strangled to death and buried in the northwest corner of the crawl space. On October 17th, 21-year-old Russell Nelson was last seen outside of a Chicago bar. He was suffocated by Gacy and buried in the crawl space. About 4 weeks after that, 16-year-old Robert Winch was murdered and buried in the crawl space. On November 18th, 20-year-old father named Tommy Bowling disappeared after leaving a Chicago bar. He too was strangled and buried in the crawl space directly beneath the hallway. 3 weeks after that, on December 9th, 19-year-old U.S. Marine David Telsma disappeared after telling his mother that he was going to go to a rock concert in Hammond, Illinois. He was strangled and buried in the crawl space. On December 30th, Gacy abducted 19-year-old Robert Donnelly from a Chicago bus stop at gunpoint. Gacy drove Robert to his house, sexually abused him, tortured him, and dunked his head underwater in the bathtub multiple times until he passed out, and then would revive him. Several hours after torturing Robert, he drove him to his work, uncuffed him, and let him go. Gacy was questioned about this entire thing on January 6th, 1978, but he claimed the entire thing was consensual. Police believed him and let him go. On February 16th, 1978, 19-year-old William Kindred disappeared after telling his fiancée that he was going to the bar for the evening. That was when Gacy abducted and murdered William and buried him in the crawl space. William Kindred was finally the last of Gacy's victims to be buried in the crawl space. In March of 1978, Gacy lured 26-year-old Jeffrey Ringnall to his car. When he got in, Gacy chloroformed him, drove him to his house, sexually abused him, tortured him with lit candles and whips, and chloroformed him again. He then drove Jeffrey to Lincoln Park and dumped him while he was still unconscious, but he was alive. After waking up, he managed to get to his girlfriend's apartment. This is the picture of him directly after this, and you can just see how dirty and beat up he looks. Once again, police were told about the assault, but didn't look too much into Gacy. Jeffrey was able to remember Gacy's black Oldsmobile. He was able to remember being on the Kennedy Expressway and named some of the side streets. He actually watched the exit on that expressway pretty much every day until April, when he finally saw Gacy's black Oldsmobile, which him and his friends followed to 8213 West Somerdale. Police arrested Gacy, but he was released on July 15th, waiting for his trial for battery. Imagine letting someone go on bail after this horrific abuse. Now, before being taken and released in July, in mid-June, 20-year-old Timothy O'Rourke went missing after leaving his apartment after telling his roommate that he was going out to buy some cigarettes. He was murdered by Gacy, but this time, Gacy started dumping his victims' bodies into the Des Plaines River. His body was found 6 miles downstream on June 30th. So after police released Gacy on bail after this horrific battery on November 4th, Gacy murdered 19-year-old Frank Landingen by shoving his own underwear down his throat, causing him to suffocate. His body was dumped in the Des Plaines River and found on November 12th. About 3 weeks later, on November 24th, 20-year-old James Mazzara went missing after spending Thanksgiving with his family. He was murdered from strangulation and was dumped in the Des Plaines River and was found on December 28th. On December 11th, 1978, Gacy visited a pharmacy in Des Plaines to discuss a potential remodeling idea with Phil Torf, who was the store owner. While he was there, he mentioned that his company hired teenage boys with a starting wage of $5 an hour, which was double the pay at the pharmacy. 15-year-old part-time pharmacy employee Robert Peast overheard this conversation and went home and told his mother that some contractor wanted to talk to him about a job. He left for the store, saying that he would be back quickly. However, when he never returned home, his parents immediately filed a missing persons report, and this was the mistake that led to Gacy being captured. Finally. So the owner of the pharmacy identified Gacy as the contractor that Robert was going to meet. Police did visit Gacy's home, but he denied ever having talked to Robert, but said that he had seen 2 young teens at the pharmacy and asked one that may or may not have been Robert if they had any remodeling materials in the store. But he did assure police that he did not offer Robert any job and said that he would go down to the station to make an official statement. He said that he couldn't go at the very moment because his uncle just died. At around 3:20 a.m., Gacy showed up to the police station completely covered in mud, saying that he had just been in a car accident. He left the police station and then went back to the police station later that day just so he could just deny knowing Robert and offering him a job. When police asked Gacy why he returned to the pharmacy at 8 a.m. on December 11th, Gacy said that he went because he had received a call from the owner telling him that he left his appointment book at the store, but police knew this was false because they had already spoken to Phil, who said that he never made this call. Des Plaines police were adamant that Gacy had something to do with Robert's disappearance, so they went ahead and checked his record and found that he had that outstanding battery charge against him in Chicago from when he abducted and tortured Jeffrey, and saw that he had served a prison sentence for the sodomy of a 15-year-old boy in Iowa. A judge ordered a search of the Gacy house on December 13th, and detectives found many suspicious items, including a 1975 Maine West high school class rings with the initials JAS engraved in it, a bunch of different driver's license, handcuffs, a 2x4 with holes drilled in the ends, a syringe, male clothing that clearly did not belong to Gacy, a 6mm pistol, various books on homosexuality, and a receipt from the pharmacy where Robert worked. Police confiscated Gacy's car and his work vehicles and set up two-man surveillance teams to follow Gacy as they continued their investigation on Robert's disappearance. On December 15th, investigators obtained more details about Gacy's battery charge. They learned that Gacy had lured Jeffrey to his car, chloroformed him, sexually abused and tortured him, and then dumped him. They conducted an interview with Gacy's ex-wife that day, and that's when they also learned about John Butkovich's disappearance. It was also that day that they traced the high school ring back to John Allen Zeich. When they went and interviewed John's mother, she told officers that her son went missing in January of 1977 and that his Motorola TV set was also missing. She had also told investigators about John's plans to sell his Plymouth satellite to Gacy. They also realized that Michael Rossi, Gacy's employee, was driving a car that was very similar to John's, so they checked the VIN and confirmed that it was actually John's car. Now, by December 16th, Gacy started inviting the surveillance detectives in for meals to his home, out to restaurants, out to bars, and into his rec room to hang out. On December 17th, investigators sat down for an interview with Michael Rossi, who told them that Gacy had bought John's car because he needed money to move to California, and that Gacy gave Rossi the car. December 17th was also when investigators searched Gacy's car and found what was thought to be a clump of human hairs. That evening, investigators used sniffer dogs to see if Robert Peist had been in any of Gacy's vehicles, and they alerted to the passenger seat in Gacy's car. That evening, Gacy had invited the two detectives into a restaurant for a meal, then again the next morning for breakfast, where Gacy talked about his past marriages, his business, and his clown activities. This is when Gacy said, you know, clowns can get away with murder. However, by the 18th of December, Gacy was starting to get increasingly agitated by the constant surveillance. He had stopped shaving his face, he looked tired and anxious, and was drinking heavily. The constant eyes on him were starting to get the best of him. He could no longer go out on his cruises for young men. So that afternoon, he decided to go talk to his lawyer about filing a civil suit against the Des Plaines police, demanding that the surveillance stop. At the same time, police were starting to get together the proper evidence for a second search warrant on his house, but they were hit with a lawsuit scheduled for December 22nd. That same afternoon, as he did, Gacy invited two of the surveillance officers into his house for lunch. One officer would try to distract Gacy with conversation, while the other would try to go and snoop around. One officer tried to write down the serial number on Gacy's Motorola TV, but he wasn't actually able to. Another officer noticed a smell coming out of the heating duct that he thought could be the smell of a decaying body. Now, while all this was going on, the serial number that was on the pharmacy receipt investigators found in Gacy's home was tracked back to 17-year-old Kim Byers, who was a co-worker of Robert Peist at the pharmacy. She told investigators that she had worn a jacket, placed the receipt in the pocket of that jacket, then gave the jacket to Robert before he left the store with Gacy. Gacy. This proved that Gacy was lying about having no contact with Robert whatsoever. Also that day, police interviewed Michael Rossi for the second time, and this time he said that in the summer of 1977, Gacy had asked him to spread 10 bags of lime, which is an inorganic material used to make things like cement in the crawl space. Then an investigator asked him where he may have put Robert Piest's body, and then he said, in the crawl space. He could have put him in the crawl space. They did do a polygraph test that came back inconclusive, but then they decided to show him a map of Cook County that was divided into 12 grid sections numbered 1 through 12, with Gacy's house being marked number 4. The investigators asked him, is the body of Robert Piest buried in grid number 4? And after asking him this question, they noticed a spike in Rossi's blood pressure. After this, Rossi refused to continue the polygraph test. Investigators then decided to interview David Cram, which was the other young man who shared Gacy's home for a while. He told investigators that Gacy tried to sexually assault him in 1976. He also said that after police searched his property on December 13th, he noticed a bit of mud on the carpet that he thought may have been from the crawl space. He said that Gacy had immediately grabbed the flashlight and looked in the crawl space to see if anyone had been digging. Gacy asked David if he had been in the crawl space, and David reminded him that he had actually asked him to spread lime and dig some trenches for plumbing. David told these officers that these trenches were 2 feet wide, 6 feet long, and 2 feet deep. Now, at this point, the walls were really starting to close in on Gacy, and he was definitely feeling the heat. On the evening of December 20th, Gacy drove over to his lawyer's office in Park Ridge for the meeting that they had set up to discuss the process of his civil suit. When he arrived, he was acting erratically and asked for a drink. His lawyer, Sam Amirante, I hope I'm saying that right, grabbed some whiskey and asked Gacy what he was worried about. Gacy picked up the Daily Herald newspaper from the lawyer's desk, pointed at the front page article that was about Robert, and said, "That boy's dead. He's in the river." It was at this point that Gacy just lost control and started rambling on and on and on into the early hours of the morning about everything that he had done. He said, "I've been the judge, jury, and executioner of many, many people," and told them that all these people were either buried in his crawl space or they were in the Des Plaines River. He referred to a few by name, but mostly just called them male prostitutes, hustlers, and liars. He said that sometimes he would just wake up and find these dead children on his floor. He told them in detail what he did to Robert. In the midst of drinking this alcohol and his rambles, he actually fell asleep partway through his confession. His lawyer immediately set up a psychiatric evaluation for 9 a.m. the next morning, but when Gacy woke up, his lawyer told him that he had just confessed to killing 30 people, and he just shook his head and said, "Well, I can't think about this right now. I've got things to do," and he did not go to a psychiatric appointment. After this, Gacy knew that he was about to go to jail for the rest of his life, so he wanted to spend his last free days with his friends and family. He drove to a coworker's house named Ronald Road, went inside, and burst into tears. He hugged Ronald and said, "I killed 30 people, give or take a few." He then left Ronald's house to go meet with Michael and David, and as he was driving, he was holding a rosary and praying. He went to David's house to sit down with David and Michael, and then went to a meeting with his lawyer. As Gacy was speaking with his lawyer, David told officers that Gacy had just confessed to 30 murders. After finishing up the meeting with his lawyer, David drove Gacy to the cemetery where his father was buried. As all of this was going on, police were in the final stages of obtaining their second search warrant when detectives were informed that because of his erratic behaviors and driving that morning, he may be on his way to take his own life. Remember, he was being followed this entire time by these surveillance teams, so they were tracking his every move. So because of this, police arrested and detained Gacy for possession of marijuana, which I hadn't gotten into a lot earlier, but he was carrying around a bag of marijuana, and police knew that, so they just decided to arrest him on whatever they could for the moment. At 4:30 p.m. on December 21st, a second search warrant was approved by Judge Marvin J. Peters. Immediately, police went over to Gacy's house and found that Gacy had unplugged the sump pump and the crawl space was flooded with water. All they really did was just plug the sump pump back in and waited for the water to drain and began their digging. An evidence technician named Daniel Genty discovered decomposing human flesh and a human arm bone. He notified officers and said, "I think this place is full of kids." Police informed Gacy that they knew about the human remains, and at this point he obviously knew his arrest was was inevitable and just wanted to clear the air. He confessed to police that he had killed 25 to 30 people since 1972 and said that they were all teenage male runaways or male prostitutes who he would abduct from the Greyhound bus station or just off the streets. Of course, the part about them all being male prostitutes and runaways was totally false, but I'm sure he used this to make himself not seem quite as bad in his own twisted way. A lot of these boys may have been runaways, but either way, they had families who loved them. Most of them were living with their families who loved them and missed them, and he had absolutely no right to take away these boys' lives. He informed police officers of his entire ruse of driving his black Oldsmobile and making the young men believe that he was an officer. He would lure them to his car and then he would kill them. He said some of the others he tricked into coming straight to his house, and then others he would just grab. He informed police officers of his handcuff and strangle trick and went into all of the dirty details of what he did to these innocent young men. He said that he would store the men under his bed for up to 24 hours before putting them in the crawl space, and then added that one of the victims was brought to the garage and embalmed before he buried him. After they were in the crawl space, he would lime the burial sites to hurry along the decomposition of the bodies and was planning to cover the entire thing in concrete in January. He said that he lost count of how many bodies were in the crawl space and that he planned on putting them in the attic, but he was worried of the leakage, so he opted for the Des Plaines River. Also, remember the time when he showed up to the police station covered in mud at 3:20 in the morning? He told officers that when he did that, this was after he was disposing of a body in a river, and he actually had gotten into a minor accident on his way to the station. He then drew a diagram of his basement to help police with the excavation of his house. So at this point, he was putting all the cards on the table. He knew that he was caught and he was donezo, so I guess he was just hurrying it along? I don't know. On December 22nd, Gacy went with officers to his house to show them where he hid John Butkovich's body in his garage. He then drove police to the spot on the I-55 bridge where he had thrown Robert and 4 other victims' bodies. Between December 22nd and December 29th, 27 bodies were discovered on Gacy's property, 26 of them being buried in his crawl space, with John's body being found under the concrete in the garage. Due to the snow, the rest of the search had to be postponed for a couple of months, and on March 9th, police found the 28th body under the barbecue pit in Gacy's yard, and on March 16th, police found skeletal remains of the 29th victim buried underneath the dining room floor. The final body count at Gacy's home was 29, and in April of 1979, Gacy's house was demolished. Soon after, 3 more bodies were found in the Des Plaines River that were confirmed to be Gacy's victims. Most of the bodies were very well decomposed, so the medical examiner relied on dental records to identify most of them. On April 9th, 1979, Robert Peast's body was found in the Des Plaines River. Of the bodies thrown into the river, only 4 had been discovered. Gacy's trial began on February 6, 1980, and he was being charged with 33 murders. The trial was held in Cook County before Judge Louis Garipo. The jury was chosen from Rockford, a nearby town, because the press coverage in Chicago was just an absolute frenzy. Of course, Gacy underwent significant psychiatric evaluations to determine if he was mentally competent to stand trial. Gacy tried to convince doctors that he had multiple personality disorder and he didn't even know when he was doing these murders. Of course, the defense entered a not guilty plea due to insanity and presented 3 experts who testified that they found Gacy to have paranoid schizophrenia and multiple personality disorder. The prosecution said that Gacy was sane and was in complete control of his actions. They brought up multiple witnesses and brought forth the efforts that Gacy went through to avoid being caught. 2 witnesses from PDM contractors testified that Gacy made them dig trenches in the crawl space. So obviously, if he was mentally competent enough to cover up his actions, he knew what was right and what was wrong, and he knew what he was doing. Michael Rossi was one of the witnesses who said that he himself didn't dig any of these trenches, but was given the task of watching over the employees who were doing so. He said that Gacy would periodically check on the employees to make sure they weren't veering off of the exact locations that they were supposed to be digging. On February 18th, the Cook County medical examiner who was appointed to supervise the excavation, Dr. Robert Stein, testified exactly how they went about the process and described just how decomposed each body was. He said that in the autopsy, he was able to determine the cause of death for all but 10 victims as either asphyxiation, strangulation, or stabbing. In the cross-examination, which is absolutely ridiculous, the defense tried to say that maybe all 33 deaths were accidental erotic asphyxia deaths, to which Dr. Stein said is highly improbable. Which, as a side note, is just laughable to me that the defense would try to say that 33 separate times he accidentally killed someone. You'd think that he'd learn after the first 10 or 20 or 30 times. But no, it kept happening. 30 times he just kept accidentally killing people. Absolutely ridiculous. Jeffrey Ringnall also testified at the trial and explained all of the torture and abuse that he had faced at the hands of Gacy in March of 1978. Again, this is the picture of him right after he got away from Gacy. He just looked completely covered in dirt and all beat up. As he was being cross-examined, Jeffrey was actually sobbing and actually vomited as he was trying to recount what happened to him. I can't even imagine having to sit in the same room as someone who did these awful things to you, having to relive the entire thing, all while having their defense lawyer try to dismantle your argument and discredit you as a witness. On February 29th, David Voorhees from earlier actually testified about what Gacy had done to him. He said that he was sexually assaulted and said that Gacy had actually paid someone to beat him up so that he wouldn't testify. Just like for Jeffrey, this was all too much for him, so he tried to say what he could before having to step down from the stand. Robert Donnelly testified next about what Gacy did to him. He too came close to breaking down this entire time, but as he was testifying, Gacy was just sitting there laughing at him, but he was able to finish his testimony. On week 5 of the trial, Gacy wrote a letter to the judge asking for a mistrial, saying that he didn't approve of his lawyer's insanity plea and said that his lawyers didn't allow him to take the witness stand like he wanted. He also said that his lawyers didn't call enough witnesses, which I don't know who would testify for John Wayne Gacy. I don't know. But of course, his request was denied. On March 11th, the closing arguments were made, and of course, the defense was adamant that there were multiple psychiatrists who said that he had no control over his actions. The prosecution argued that he had complete ability to control his actions, and the evidence points towards that as well. On March 12th, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours and found John Wayne Gacy guilty of 33 murders, sexual assault, and taking indecent liberties with a child in relation to Robert Piest. He was sentenced to death and was scheduled to be executed on June 2nd, 1980. After being sentenced, Gacy was sent to the Menard Correctional Center in Chester, Illinois, where he sat on death row for 14 years. He spent his time in isolation painting pictures of clowns that had been displayed and sold for exuberant amounts of money. When I think back again to episode number 2 about the motives, I mean, it wasn't a motive for him to kill to be famous, but he definitely took advantage of it while he was in prison, and the families of these victims are absolutely appalled at the amount of money that people are willing to spend on a painting from a deranged killer. It is just absolutely ridiculous. At one point, John Wayne Gacy was stabbed in the arm by another inmate, but was fine after going to the hospital and receiving treatment. He applied for multiple appeals, but all were rejected, and the Illinois Supreme Court finally set his official execution date for May 10th, 1994. On the morning of May 9th, he was transferred to the Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill to be executed. For his last meal, he ate a bucket of KFC, a dozen frozen shrimps, fries, strawberries, and a Diet Coke. He had a prayer with a Catholic priest that night and was then escorted to the execution chamber to be executed by lethal injection, which is way too easy of a death on him, honestly. In the hours leading up to the execution, a crowd of over 1,000 people gathered outside of the correctional center, some of which were actually anti-death penalty protesters. Which I get that some people find it wrong, which is a totally understandable and reasonable opinion, but how could someone find it so wrong that they want to protest the execution of this sick, twisted monster? I don't understand. But either way, a lot of people were having a great time. People were wearing t-shirts with clowns on them. Some of them had slogans like "No tears for the clown." People were just absolutely ecstatic that this monster was going to be put down. Now, when they initially went to do the injection, the chemicals actually solidified and clogged the tube, making it so they had to make a new tube to do the execution. After they did this, the execution was resumed, and the execution actually took 18 minutes. Apparently, the entire time that he was in prison, he showed absolutely no remorse for his victims, and his last words were, kiss my ass. Gacy was confirmed dead at 12:58 a.m. on May 10th, 1994. After this, his brain was actually removed and is currently in possession of Helen Morrison, a woman who had interviewed Gacy and other serial killers who is trying to figure out certain personality traits of psychopaths. After the execution and brain removal, he was cremated. Now, there is so much more to this case that I couldn't even get into just for the sake of time. There were possible additional victims, possible accomplices. There were all these movies and media, but if I went into all of that, then this video would be hours long. This case is just absolutely horrific, and I cannot believe that it was allowed to go on as long as it did. It seemed as if there was a lot of shoddy and lazy police work going on this entire time. So many times it seemed that police just looked the other way, or Gacy was able to find these random loopholes to just get away. I find it interesting to look at the history and background of these killers to try and find connections. As I've been saying in pretty much every video in this series, it seems like the biggest connection that we find are histories of severe childhood abuse. Now, what I wish I knew more about was the connections between what each person went through and what they went on to do, or, other contributing factors like, again, genetics or brain structure or brain chemistry, because we know the general brain chemistry and structure like we discussed in episode 1, but we don't necessarily know the intricate details of what exactly causes this type of killer. What made John Wayne Gacy feel the need to go out almost every week for 2 years to find a new victim to just kill and dispose, versus Albert Fish, who, yes, he killed less people, but he literally ate them, and he chose children as his victims. I don't really understand why some killers turn out the way that they do versus others. So if there was more that I wish that I knew, that would be it. I just wish that I could look at some of the brains of these monsters myself to find out more information. I want to know exactly what it is that makes these individuals different than any other child who faced abuse but didn't grow up to be a heinous monster. Or serial killers who didn't face childhood abuse and did grow up to be a heinous monster. Or even what causes each person to choose the way they kill their victims and choose the types of victims that they kill. So that is it for the John Wayne Gacy case. Thank you for watching and pondering with me.